That just sort of allows him to sit down, put his pipe on the rails. It's a little bit less work for his body. He's gonna go in and take a gather. You'll notice he has to turn the entire time. So if Misha ever stops turning once he has that fresh glass out of the furnace, gravity will just pull that molten material right to the ground. Misha's over on our marbering table. Marver comes from the Italian word for marble, which is what they were originally made out of. That's just sort of something that allows us to cool and shape the glass. So since Misha's making it into a nice cylinder, he can push nice and hard on the marver and really quickly make that nice. Misha's making what we call a collar. So we make a collar because this is a shared space. So our entire furnace is made out of colorless glass. So basically, all of the different artists in here can add our color separately. So Misha's prepping to pick up a chunk of color bar, and this is what it looks like. Since it's so thick, we have to sort of preheat it in a kiln, and then we can pick it up and heat it all the way back up to working temperature. So Misha has a nice little chunk of red in there. I'll get the door for you. And if Misha were to just try to pick up this at room temperature, the thermal shock of the hot glass on the collar is too much and it'll cause it to crack and break. So he's going to go into our pickup kiln. And I know I said it's 900 degrees and that seems pretty hot, but that's really just similar to room temperature for the glass. That's sort of annealing point. So that's where all the stress can sort of come out of the material. You gonna need a brush? Sometimes we can pick up kiln dust in there. So Misha's just gonna give it a nice little brush off. Most of our equipment is made out of something called fire brick. So it's really just a really high temperature ceramic material. If you're familiar with ceramics, ceramics is actually much hotter than this. So we're working at like a cone 3 or a 4. So we can have everything be made out of ceramic material. So our pickup kiln is ceramic, our furnace is mostly ceramic, our reheating chamber is ceramic. And metal, of course there's metal. So Misha's gonna take that back up to working temperature. And glass color doesn't really work like paint color. We can't sort of take red glass and blue glass and make purple glass. Glass color is made entirely chemically. So when we're working in a furnace, our furnace is of course colorless, but we could add a little bit of like copper or cobalt. And just throwing that metal in there is enough to tint that whole pot bright blue. So it can be really easy to make color. This facility is a public access studio, so we like to really have a lot of different options for people. So we melt colorless glass, and then we can all sort of add different colors on through color bar or something called frit, which we'll use a little bit later. If you guys ever come and take a workshop, we usually use frit just because it's much faster to be able to pick up. So it's sort of like sand. And since these glass pieces are so small, they heat up enough quickly that we don't have to preheat the frit before we roll it up. So we'll use frit a little bit later on. But the main difference between frit and color bar is that if you were to go into like our cafe and take an object and you were to buy it and then smash it, you could see that razor thin layer of color on the inside. And that's how we know something is made with color bar. This is sort of a thing that studio glass artists do a lot more. If you were to buy something from like Libby, those facilities have their own furnace colors and they'll spend a couple months working on blue or a couple months working on pink and then just make enough inventory. So Misha's got that nice and shaped up. The other thing about glass color is when it's hot, it never really looks the same as when it's cool. So even though this is sort of a brown dingy color, we know it's red from when we put it in the kiln, and then when we take it out, it'll turn back to red. So now that Misha's nice and set up, he can go back into the furnace. Glass color sort of heats up at different rates. So red is typically a pretty stiff color, so it takes a lot of heat to heat up. If we were working with something like a blue, like that cobalt blue I mentioned earlier, that stuff can get really hot really fast. So you want to make sure you're nice and set up before you go back into the furnace. Because if Misha loses any of this color in there, the metals that are in the bar are enough to really tint the entire furnace into one color. Misha's going to our pipe cooler. You want a 10, or do you think you can fit in the 8? Oop. He's gonna go in with our wooden block tool. And since we have that nice fresh gather on the outside, Misha can really manipulate that glass on its own. So he's gonna push a lot of that clear material straight to the bottom. And we have a lot of different tools, but the wooden tools are really, really nice. They're made out of a cherry wood or a fruit wood, so they have this really, really tight grain pattern. So that means there's just not a lot of sap in there. So if we were to use something like oak, it's gonna catch on fire really, really quickly. This allows us to sort of work with the material without taking too much heat out, because heat's sort of the name of the game. And we like to say that glass sort of has a heat memory. So every time Misha touches it on the marver, it's really gonna remember that heat and keep that shape. But the block is a little bit softer of a tool to shape with. So now we're sort of working in layers, right? Because if Misha wanted to get enough glass for this piece at once, he's gonna have to turn way too fast. So we're gonna let each layer sort of set up individually, and then we can go into our reheating chamber and even that heat out before we start to introduce any air. So Misha's gonna put a nice skin on this. When we start putting air into the glass, the air wants to go where the bubble is the warmest. So in order to make sure it doesn't shoot straight to the tip, Misha can give it a nice cool. And he's not blowing crazy hard. He has a lovely noodle. So we have our nice blow hoses as a sort of precaution for the pandemic. Normally you would see me and Misha working much closer, and I could blow on the end of the pipe through that mouthpiece. But we have these nice little hoses, which are just a piece of surgical tubing attached to a swivel that we can stick onto the end of our pipe. Okay, we're gonna do another dip on top. This is probably enough to make like a nice cup, but we're gonna go a little bit bigger. So now that Misha has a bubble in there, he really has to let that set up. If his bubble is too hot and he goes back into the furnace, it can totally cause it to collapse. And then when we start inflating later on, it's gonna be a lot more challenging. So we'll let that set up. And every time Misha takes a gather, the glass basically doubles in volume. So that can make it really hard to control how much glass that you're getting. So Misha's just taking what we call a strip gather. And that sort of allows us to control and physically use gravity to peel off some of that material. Now you can really see. So as we start inflating, that layer of clear glass that you see on the outside is really going to start to disappear. Sort of an optical illusion. Color bar really uses the optic properties of glass to sort of trick your eyes into thinking that the object is red all the way through. You getting ready for the optic mold? Yeah. I'll go ahead and show him. So Misha's using something we call an optic mold. And this just sort of has these nice ridges. Remember, glass has this memory. So when Misha goes into the mold, those ridges, the ridges of the mold are cold enough that that glass is going to remain in this shape. This is a pretty common mold that we use. We use it for like easy things like pumpkins and that sort of thing. But it can really add a lot of different qualities to the glass. So Misha's got to make sure he can fit in that mold. And Misha's using a pretty fun tool. Most of our tools are made out of that wood I talked about before, or stainless steel, just like the punny rods. But Misha's using our newspaper tool, which is made out of newspaper. It's basically 8 to 10 sheets of newspaper folded up. And this is the closest we can ever get to physically touching the glass. So like when potters throw pots, they like feel the profile of the object the whole time. But obviously we can't do that. So Our newspaper is the closest we can get. And later on, you'll see Misha really feel the side of the piece, so that way he can tell where the profile is. So now you can see those nice ridges. And glass will have that memory, so those will stay pretty prominent, especially with this deep of a point mold. For Misha to melt these out, he's going to have to take it all the way back up, basically to the furnace temperature, which is harder than it seems. So now that we've got our optics in, Misha can really start to inflate our bubble. He's got that newspaper tool, and what he's focusing on the bottom is so that he can really make sure that air doesn't shoot straight to the tip. When we're working in here, we really have to think about how this object is going to be used later on. So you'll really notice at this point, Misha's really enforcing bottom weight into the object. The hardest part of working with this material is that, like, when we're done with the piece, we can't set it on the table and see how it sits. We really have to let it set up and cool down in our annealing oven before we can touch it. So when you first start blowing glass, you sort of learn the basic properties of what your object needs to survive. And bottom weighting is important just because, since these are designed to be functional objects, if you have like a base on a shelf and a kid bumps into it, if it's top heavy, it can really easily wobble around and fall over. Right now, Misha's putting a nice neck into this. So he's constricting down and physically pulling. And this is what we call our jack line, or our constriction line. And this is sort of one of the basic principles of glass blowing. You notice nothing in our collection has a pipe stuck to the end of it. So in order to really get this thing off of the pipe, we have to put in that nice constriction line. And Misha put that constriction line in with a tool called the jacks. So the jacks are sort of our iconic glass blower tool. They're modeled off of a pair of shears, so they allow us to physically cut into the glass. And Misha's not squeezing crazy hard. He wants to be really, really gentle with the material, especially at this temperature. So really, all of the stuff that's doing the work is Misha's left hand that's turning. Now that he's got that jack line in, he's going to do something we call spot heating. So if Misha gets that jack line too hot, the entire piece is going to wobble a lot, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. So you'll notice he's just heating the bottom portion of our bubble. When we work in here, we're really working from the top down. So where that constriction line is later going to become the top of our vase. He's just got that nice little air hose. That compressed air is really enough to really cause that glass to freeze up pretty quickly. And when he's working in here, that reheating chamber is giving a really aggressive heat all across the bubble. So if it ever gets too hot, he can come back out, give it a little shoot with the compressed air, and that can let him get it even hotter. Now he's using a little bit of gravity to pull down the sides of that glass. So since Misha put that bottom weight in there, that glass has that memory of that weight. So as it's pulling down, it'll elongate and thin out the sides, make it nice and even. Now that Misha's sort of got his basic shape, he can go back in with his jacks and sort of really start to clean up that bubble. That sounds good. We're going to stretch it out a little bit more. The really cool thing about hot glass is that it's infinitely elastic. So if Misha were to take a fresh gather, he could grab one end of the pipe, I could grab the other end of the glass with a tool, and we could pretty much run across the entire building, and that glass will keep stretching and stretching. So if Misha gets this bubble ripping, we could pull it tons of feet. We'll give it a nice paper. This really lets Misha feel the profile of his face. And he's physically squeezing a little bit just to sort of give it that little waist that you see. Misha could put this in with his jacks, but it's going to be a lot harsher and more crisp of a line. So that paper allows this to be a little bit softer. And that paper is waterlogged just like our blocks. It sort of creates a steam barrier. So the paper never really touches the glass. That water makes something called the Leidenfrost effect. So if you have a hot pan on your stove and you throw water on it, it does that little dancey thing. That's our Leidenfrost effect, and that's what's physically shaping the glass. And if you take care of your paper, it can really last a long time. I know people who keep theirs in a Ziploc baggie and they tuck it in at night, and it'll last them years if they really take care of it. Some people have different preferences for newsprint that they use. It's good not to use something with a lot of color, just because that colored ink can start to burn. And nobody wants to breathe that in. So Misha's blowing, he's giving it a little bit more of a shape. I think we're getting closer. Knowing Misha, I think he's going to do one more. Get it really nice and crisp. I'll put some water on this paper. And here you can really see the difference in the heat. So in that bottom section, it's really glowing bright red. And up by our jack line, it's a little bit more set up. So that's a little bit closer to its actual color, but it's more than likely, reds turn out to be really brown when you're working with them, and they do sort of a chemical change inside of the kiln, and they turn into that nice bright red. Misha's got his nice bubble. You can see those ridges in there. And one of the cool things about working with hot glass is you can really see how the materials move. So you can see they're a little less pronounced in the bottom just because Misha's inflated that a little bit more. You want a cookie? I'm going to steal your diamond shears. So I'm going to make Misha something called a cookie foot. And it'll make sense when you see the shape, but when we refer to things in glass, you really refer to it like a body. So the part up by the constriction line is usually what we call the neck, and then it's our shoulder, and then our foot at the bottom. Do you have a preference for these for punty? Okay. So I'm going to make Misha a quick double dip. And this is just going to be a little bit extra weight on the bottom. When we're working in here, we really have to design for later on. So this is going to allow this object to make really nice contact with the table or whatever it's sitting on. Okay. So I'm going to come over to our marver, go straight up and down. And that gravity naturally pulls all that glass off. It's a little big, sorry. So the really nice thing about hot glass is that it immediately sticks to hot glass. So Misha doesn't have to really do any extra work in order to fuse this on there. I'll bring his diamond shears back to him. Since this glass is so fresh and that bubble is a little bit more solid, Misha has a little bit of extra working time. So we can really make this foot nice. So Misha's going to come in with this newspaper, and he's going to physically change the shape of that foot by pressing and holding. He's got his thumb up in there in the bottom. And that's so we can really design how this is going to make contact with the table. Giving it a little bit crisper with the jacks. I'm on here with this wooden paddle. This is made out of that same wood, that cherry or fruit wood. And this sort of allows us to make sure we've got a nice flat bottom. Obviously, Misha doesn't have like 12 hands, so I'm here over here and I can make sure that bottom is nice and correct and will make good contact with the table. So we're gonna let that cookie foot set up a little bit. You can see even now how much the heat difference is between our foot and our bubble. So Misha's gonna take a series of quick flashes or like maintenance heats. And that's gonna allow us to let this set up a little bit. What we're gonna do next is we're gonna put a punty on the bottom of this. So if we were to break this off of the bubble now, the only option we have for finishing is that sharp top. So we're gonna make a connection point onto the bottom, break it off of the pipe, and flip it around. So that way Misha can finish the top off nicely. Ready? So I'm gonna make Misha a punty. This is just one little dip of glass. And I want this to be sort of a Q-tip shape. This is a connection that's designed to fail. So later on, we're gonna need to take it off of the pipe. And if it's too pointy or too weird, it won't come off really nicely. And then we'll have to cold work it later, which is more work than we wanna do. This is the part where I get really quiet because I have to focus. If I make Misha too small or too weak of a punty, this piece can really easily fall off onto the ground when we do this. So it takes a lot of experience to really understand what sort of heat that we need. Sorry, it's a little warm. Misha's going on and he's making sure I'm nice and on center. Yeah, I can take that. Okay. When we're working in here, we're always thinking about being on center. So like when you take a ceramics class, at the beginning you sort of have to center the clay. The entire time that Misha's turning, he's really working and making sure he's on center on his own. When you see glass blowing, you think your tooling hand will be the one doing most of the work. But often you'll see glass blowers will have a much bigger left forearm just from all the turning. Misha's going on with his little paddle, making sure it's nice and straight. If this falls like super off center and we go to open it, the top of this vase is going to be super crooked and it's going to be really easy to tell. Do you want to trim it?
Yeah, I'm going to tweeze and trim.
Okay, then lip wrap. So now we have sort of that harsh, jagged edge, and the shoulder is typically the part of the glass that stays the thickest. So in order to combat that, we're going to trim the top of this piece off. And Misha could do this with a pair of shears, which are just like your regular old scissors, just big and stainless steel. But we got a little bit of a trick, and we're going to use that same principle that we used in order to break this off of the blowpipe, in order to clean up that front edge. That's fair. This is sort of a time where we have to take a lot of heat, and you'll notice normally Misha's up and down and up and down. But that jackline was just cold enough for us to physically break it off of the pipe. So we got to let it set up a little bit. And that way we can really start to pull. Glass really only has like a few key properties, and we can really use those to our advantage. And the constriction line is really a good tool for us. When we are doing this, a lot of the cups you get made sort of in a factory setting won't actually do this. They'll do something called hot popping. So they'll take our bubble that we broke off of the blowpipe, stick it in the annealer, let it cool down, and then later on they'll just cut off the top of that ring. And then they'll take some fire and they'll polish that cut. So how you can tell something is hand blown in a hot shop, a really good way to tell is to look at the bottom. It'll have that mark from that punty. So it'll just have a little bit of a divot. Misha's giving it a good pull now. And you can tell something's sort of made in a mold if it's nice and smooth on the bottom. There's Misha putting in that constriction line. He's gonna go on the outside, and he's both shrinking it down, but he's also selectively cooling it. Those jack blades are so narrow enough that they're enough of a coolant to really make that line nice and crisp. Misha's gonna give it one more safety cool. And he takes that flash just because if it's his punty is too cool on the back, this is a time where it's really easy to knock it off onto the ground. I'm gonna grab his tweezers. He's gonna give it a quick bunch. Then I can give it a tap and it comes right off. So when I'm tapping, I'm not like, sometimes you gotta really go for it if your glass is thick enough. But you don't want to be too gentle because it won't be enough force to knock it off. That sounds good. We're going to paddle this lip, make sure it's nice and smooth. And then we're going to stick something on called a lip wrap. And remember, it's all parts of the body. So this opening is what we call our lip.
Take that lip wrap.
What? Okay, I'm just gonna get a little bit more. That way you have something to snip. Like that? Okay. So I'm gonna go into our frit. And this is a pretty small size of frit. So it can be sort of hard to tell that it's tiny chunks of glass when it's added on separately. You want a pointy? So I'm going to give it a couple coats. With a light color like this, sometimes you really have to pack it on. Because as we start to stretch this lip wrap out, that color will thin out a little bit. That sound always scares me. I thought that was the piece. In order to get the glass off of the pipes, we'll actually stick them in these buckets over here. I'm just gonna sneak right onto you. Ooh, sorry. Thank you. So they cool down in these buckets, and as they cool down, that's enough of a temperature difference for it to just peel right off of the pipe. Probably. I'm going to reshape this a little bit. Just because it's a little icky. Okay. So I'm going to get this nice and hot. Remember, hot glass sticks to hot things really easily. So I'm going to come around behind Misha. He'll snip, we'll flip, and then he can stick it right on. And how he's stretching and pulling is really determining the width of the lip wrap. And you'll notice he doesn't have to cut me off. Remember that glass is really, really elastic. So if he pulls hard enough, it'll make something called a stringer, and that stringer will just pull right away. So now we can start to open this bad boy up. So Misha's gonna use his jacks again, but he's gonna use them at a different angle. So instead of going straight up and down, he's gonna go sideways and slowly lift up. If Misha were to just go in and lift up really quick, it's gonna cause a huge divot.
2 seconds. On light. Good.
So now that we've got that lip wrap sort of melted into the whole bubble, Misha's gonna take a couple of heats and he's gonna open this a little bit slowly. Especially with a color like red, it'll sort of be a little tricky. But Misha, when he's turning, is really doing a lot of the work. So as he's lifting, that spinning is really opening the glass more than the pressure he has on the tool. Okay. Misha's gonna go in with his paper and squeeze that waste in a little bit. And this is a really nice thing about the paper, is that he can really feel that profile even once we're off of the blowpipe. Then we'll get that hot heat, the top nice and hot.
I'll try to squeeze once more and then I'll start over.
Okay, we're gonna do that one more time. I feel like in glass blowing you can do something and you do it once to sort of get the general shape. And then we'll usually do it a couple times just to really crisp it up and make it nice and even. Yellow is always tough because it always takes a lot of heat to get yellow really hot. Yellow and orange.
I do that same move, so paper, and then I'll lift up too.
Sounds good. So Misha's gonna tuck that back in, make sure that stays nice and narrow.
And the last one will probably be the final one. Yep, on. Where I'll just kind of layer it open.
Okay. This is the time where Misha's really focusing on his turning. So when we're working in here, we're always thinking about something called centrifugal force. So if Misha spins a little bit faster, that glass is going to naturally pull and widen out a little bit. So you can already see how different that shape is from when we went into the reheating chamber. I'm coming on with this paddle just to make sure that top stays nice and flat. And Misha can go back in and tuck that in. I'm going to open another door for him. We have these nice doors on our reheating chamber, just so that when we're working, we can keep them as closed as possible. Because this thing's rocking at about 2100 degrees. So you can imagine all that heat once those doors start opening get you really, really sweaty. You ready?
Yeah, once they're flashing down.
Okay. So that lip was just hot enough for us to really be working it. So Misha's doing something called flashing down. He's really evening out the heat in this piece. Misha's using something called a map torch, or a map gas, which is just a tiny little torch. Our reheating chamber has really aggressive heating from all angles, so Misha can use this to specifically heat his punty. And we're going to use that same principle that we did to take it off of the jack line. We're just going to add a little bit of water and a little bit of vibration, and that vibration will go through the pipe and knock this off. What Misha's really looking for is a little bit of movement in the punty. So I have my nice Kevlar outfit on. This glass looks room temperature and it looks set up, but it's still probably about 1000 degrees. So obviously we can't touch it. So I got these nice Kevlar gloves that allow me to pick stuff up. He's just going to use a little bit of water, and he's going to place it right where that putty connects to the foot. He'll give it a little tap, and it'll come right off. He'll give it a little torch. He's going to melt that putty mark in. That way it's nice and smooth and nobody cuts their hands on it. And then he can give it a little stamp with one of our brass stamps. That way you know it's made here. So we put that away in our annealing oven. That oven sits at about 900 degrees, so that's the same temperature as our pickup kiln, which is that annealing temperature. And the thickest part of that object is that foot, so it's about that thick. So that's probably gonna have to anneal over about 24 hours. So we'll send this down once we're done with our demo, and then we can pull it out of the oven the next day. Some of our larger pieces, like if you look in the gallery, we have that large cast bench in the ancient collection. That piece annealed for about 11 months, and it still has tiny cracks in it. So you can see how much you have to really take care of the glass as you start to cool it down. If you guys have any questions, you can sort of comment them in the comments, and Caitlin can read them to me. Otherwise, the galleries are open. We don't have glass blowing demonstrations happening, but we have them through live stream. So if you guys ever want to come in, as long as you have your mask, you can go and look through the gallery and the collection. Caitlin? Good? Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you on Friday.